You're listening to Design Systems Beyond the Button, where we dive into everything related to design systems for everyone from newbies to seasoned practitioners. I'm Nef, Product Marketing Manager at zeroheight, and I'm excited to use this podcast to get my burning design systems questions answered. I'm joined by my colleague Michelle Chin, a design advocate who has seen and experienced so much around design systems. Hey, Michelle.
Hey, and I'm looking forward to sharing the tips, tricks, and experiences based on what I've done, but also from what I've seen from other design system teams. There's not so much being publicly said because design systems can be so personal to a company. So, this might be a great way to shed some insight so you can create your own very bestest design system ever.
All right. Today's topic question is, how do you start a design system so it's successful? We've had two episodes of our podcast so far where we've talked about who the users are and what the parts of a design system ought to be. And we know that there is so much work that goes into creating a design system and launching it. And then there's a ton of work that happens after you launch it. And it's rewarding, but what does success even mean? So I suppose to start us out, I wonder is there some sort of success criterion in your experience, Michelle, in terms of how we figure out if a design system is killing it or if we might need to change course a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because I think, there are multiple levels to a design system. And I think some people can think success is like, well, I have all the components
Mm,
and they're all made, they're coded, they're in Figma. So check, we're done. But really, success is the fact that people are using it and actively using your design system because it's not successful if people aren't using it. I think it's just a nice little project if if you make components and buttons and no one's using it. So really, it's people actively using it, engaging with it, contributing to it, um, putting it into the product, and that's really what success is.
yeah, totally. I feel like when I've spoken to a lot of design systems teams, though, it seems like there's a little bit of a black box, right? Like you create the design system, you make sure that the components are all there and they're in a place where they can be used. But then after that, unless you have really good processes in place, you kind of don't know who's using those components or what level of adoption you actually have. So I suppose my question is like, how do you know that people are using the components in the product? And then I suppose another question there is, how do we know that people are using the components with fidelity, that there aren't tons of detachments and all of that sort of stuff?
Yeah, so I think we can take a look at it from two different lenses, like from the design aspect. So depending on what design tool you're using, if you're using like Figma, they
Mm,
have some stats built in where you can see the number of detachments. And that can be a good indicator of, are people following the design system if there are very few detachments? Detachments can be a false positive too, because sometimes you might have a component that should be detached purposefully. Um,
mm,
but, you have to kind of look at it like, okay, this is a component that shouldn't be detached and, it has a high detach rate. What's going on? Um, and there could be very good reasons for that. So it might require some investigating. But I think, keeping track of those metrics from the start, like knowing how you're going to understand what success means. So like, um, I think a lot of times people are like, okay, we just have to get these components designed and made and created, and they're not worried about like the next step, but they should be thinking about the next step of like, okay, how are we going to ensure that people are going to use this? So I think one of the things is making sure you're tracking, if you're using Figma, detached rates.
mm.
Um, and I think also the tools nowadays are doing a really good job of capturing these metrics because before you had to like really you couldn't track these easily. Like you'd have to go into people's project files and stuff like that. So the tools are making this a lot easier for everyone as well. From the coding perspective, I'm not a developer, but I know that some development teams will do little code checks to see,
Mm,
are these buttons using the button component? If they're not, they'll get flagged to see why. How much, they'll have these little flags in place to kind of catch, how much of the code is using the design system. So that's also another thing that can be put into place just to make sure people are using it.
For sure. And I would imagine that 100% is not the goal. There are always going to be instances of code and instances of design that are not referencing the design system. Is there a percentage or an ideal that you've used in your career to say, sort of strive for?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think I've ever seen like an actual percentage of like a good guideline. I think because it really just depends per your product. But
Mm,
I think the big thing is like, you know, getting a baseline of what seems to be normal for your team, or getting a baseline to start with to see what the percentage is, and then testing it a couple months later or a year later to see if that number has gone up or down, and try to figure out like why that might have gone up or down. Because like you said, it really depends. There can be, there might be some reasons why things aren't following a design system for a very good reason. Maybe it's like an experimental component that hasn't been finalized and added to the system yet. And that's completely fine. But I think the big thing is you want to make sure that at a baseline, people are using the design system and consuming those components, like those coded components. I know that sometimes teams will improperly use a design system.
hmm.
So they will take the code, and so instead of pulling the component into their code, they will copy the code and paste it into the screen that they're coding, which to them it looks like they're using the design system because they're like, I copied the code rather than pulling the component. Um, so the component, does look like what it's supposed to look like, except it's not using the actual component itself. Um, and you want to avoid issues like that. So
Yeah. And I guess for the marketer in me, what's the problem if somebody does that? What happens if they copy and paste the code versus using the component?
yeah, so that's a great question because it does like, looks the same in the end. But I think the big thing is, in the short term, it's fine. Long term, if you were to change, like say the font used in the button label
Mm,
or the colors, it you could ideally what you would do is change it in the design system, the coded component, and then it would be pushed out everywhere and it would be reflected everywhere very quickly. But if someone copies and pastes the code, then that change wouldn't permeate to that particular copy and paste job.
yeah, totally. That makes sense. And I feel like that maybe is a call out to the importance of educating folks on how to use a design system, which I know we've talked about before, but I suppose your success is somewhat dependent on the education that you've provided for your colleagues around what it means to use the design system, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I definitely think like I would encourage people to start that education earlier than later. So rather than wait to, while you're working on coded components and design components and then revealing the design system, but letting them know that hey, this is coming and why this is
Mm,
coming, and that the expectation is that we want people to actively consume the design system and explain why. So even though it's not done yet, or maybe you've made like two components, you can at least say, "Hey, this is coming. This is what it's gonna look like." So, I think getting them on board early just to get them used to the fact that this is a little bit of a change that's gonna happen is gonna be very helpful in navigating that success.
for sure. We had a webinar a couple of days ago where we talked about design system adoption and design system governance. And one of the big tidbits that I got out of that was around sharing the vision of a design system early and often. I think a lot of times we talked about it in terms of like, hey, we want to have these reusable components. And that is like very, very important, certainly. But when you say, hey, the reason that we are creating a design system is that we want to reduce the amount of technical debt that we have and we want to make it easier to make changes in the future, and everybody sort of like buys into that vision, then that developer who is like sort of thinking, okay, do I use the component or do I copy and paste, might say, oh, wait, the reason that we have the design system is not just around making me more efficient, which perhaps is solved by copying and pasting the component or copying and pasting the code, but the reason that we have it is around the future of like what we're building technologically. So let me take a moment to do this the right way. So it seems like that continues to come up in terms of like how we think about education and how we think about framing the purpose of a design system.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that you hit the nail on the head. Like that's exactly the idea that we everyone, who was creating design system wants designers and engineers to understand, to be like understanding the value of the long term. And yeah, it's a little bit of a behavioral change or process change to your day to day, but like in the end it will make your life much easier. Um, and I think it's kind of, the earlier you can set that in momentum, like the more prepared people can be to
Mm.
know that this change is going to be coming, the better. Because I think, when you flip a switch and be like, "Hey, we're all just going to use this new tool," it can be very, very jarring for people. But if people can ease into it, I think that can really help the design system become, really successful.
Yeah, 100%. So I know we sort of talked about some of these quantitative metrics that you might be able to get from places like Figma and the sort, but I would imagine that there also are some qualitative metrics that you might want to track in order to determine the success of your design system. Can you tell me a little bit about how you might go about getting those? And I suppose who are you getting them from? Like, who are the most important people to survey and get feedback from?
Yeah, that's another great question. I think, everyone's so focused on quantitative metrics, but qualitative metrics are just as important. So I guess there's a couple things you can do. So from a qualitative standpoint, when you look at like the product, you can see, does you can do a cursory check. Does the product, is it starting to look more uniform across other products? Is the UI just starting to look more uniform? If it's not, maybe there's an issue there. Um, and then if the people who actually use the design system, checking in with them to see how they're doing, like what do they like about the design system, what do they not like about the design system, like kind of almost doing like a retro and getting some
Mm,
feedback from them is really helpful. Because I think the thing is like um, and this is interesting because like when I first became a manager, this like director of engineering like saw me in the break room, was like, "Congrats on becoming a manager." And I was like, "Thanks." And then he was like, "It's all about the emotions." And I was like, no, I don't know. I was like, I have one direct report. He's pretty like even keel. It's fine. And then the next thing you know, like the my direct report was like, I wouldn't say super emotional, but like he came to me with like a problem that had to deal with emotions. And I was like, oh my
huh.
gosh, this engineering director was right. Like, and it really is like when it comes to working with people, there's a lot of emotions involved. Even though you can be like, this is a very practical system, it makes sense. It's very logical. Engineers are logical. There's a huge emotional aspect to things, whether we realize that or not. Um, so checking in with people to see how they feel and how they're working with things, what's frustrating them, what's leading to their success is super, super important to understanding how you can adapt or improve the design system to ensure that people are using it and that it is successful. So it's really important to get that qualitative aspect as well, not just, how many detachments are we having? What's the number of adoption, in terms of like coded components? Like it's very
Mhm.
much important to get that qualitative.
Yeah, totally. I suppose on one hand, if you had a high detachment rate, that tells you part of the story, but then the qualitative feedback would perhaps tell you why are people detaching. It would actually give you what you need in order to make a change. But on the other end of the spectrum, I would think that those success stories are also really important to hear and like things that you might want to like give a platform to say like, hey, this designer is having this amazing experience using the design system and almost use it as a case study. And to your point, like if people are looking for emotions, they're also looking for stories and something that they can like sort of like latch themselves onto. And you only get those stories like qualitatively, right?
Yeah, very much so. So like even, you might not think it's worth like talking to people about a design system if it's going well, but getting those almost those like, quotes from people that like those
Mm,
like nice sentiments of like, this has made me so much more productive, or I can now think about other things and not worry about X, Y, and Z, or I'm not having to craft components or code things from scratch. Because this very much goes for both designers and engineers. Like it's really helpful to get those testimonials because I think a lot of it is other people might need to trust in others because it's one thing to, um, you like people as a design system maker can promote the design system all day and all night, but everyone kind of knows that we're almost advertising it, right? So if you have someone who is consuming it that isn't necessarily like an advertiser of it, they if they give a good testimonial, then other people, who might have the same role or work with them can be like, oh, if so and so really enjoyed using this or found a lot of benefit, I probably can too. So you almost have these like outside like influencers, so
Mhm.
to speak, who can really get other people bought into using the design system.
Yeah, totally. It seems like a lot of the things that we talked about thus far work really well for folks who are starting a design system from scratch. I think that there is a whole nother group of folks who are starting maybe the company's third or fourth design system, and previous attempts have failed, or they have not been adopted, or perhaps they haven't been updated, or whatever might have led to that failure. When folks maybe have a little bit of a bad taste in their mouths around design systems, is there a different sort of set of steps that people should follow in order to sort of convince the company that this attempt is going to be different, that it is going to be successful?
Yeah, it's great that you bring this up. It's also bringing up a little bit of trauma. So, my last place I worked at, like, the design system had a lot of false starts,
Mm.
and a lot of times, like, every time it was like people were like, "Yes, this is gonna be the time that the design system's gonna stick. I just know it." And it took on various, like, more like different like strategies and different approaches, none of which were successful until like several iterations later. So yeah, there is that some like that the design system fatigue. um
Mm.
and I think a lot of it comes to building trust, and accepting and understanding and admitting to where the shortcomings were for the previous iterations and what you are doing to make things different. Um, so it went all the way from like we had a third party contractor to like create the design system, and they had like 3 months, and there was no way that in 3 months, like for an enterprise company, that any company could make a design system. um, and so like it can't yeah, like we had lots of evolutions, and so it came to being like, talking about it, saying, "Hey, we made some mistakes. We
Mhm.
realized what they were. We are going to try this again. This is the approach we're going to take." And then I think because we didn't have like a fully like staff design system team per se, it was more federated. So we took a group of designers who were working on other products and had them contribute. So I think for them, there was more involvement, and they had a stake in the success of it because they were the people who were going to be using it. So it took a lot of trust building. So I think it was like a lot of it's also moving slow, and not trying to rush things, and just going at a good pace that everyone was like, okay, I can see progress. I can see this is going well. I can see that there is a future in this. So it does take a little bit because you do have to get through that baggage.
Mhm. Yeah. Do you think in that instance you were sort of shouting a little bit more about smaller wins than you would have had there not have been that baggage?
Yeah, I think so. I think definitely like we started from scratch, and we were like, let's just start from scratch and like not completely start, but like let's see what we have done, but like knowing that we're kind of starting from zero again. And then we took a very like paced approach. So we created a team charter for the
Mm.
design system team. We shared that with the broader team. We created principles to show that we were the real deal. We weren't just trying to hurry up and make components and push them out to somebody. It was like we're standing up this design system like collective. We have principles, and it does take a little bit of extra time, I would say, but
Sure.
considering the baggage point that we came from, like it probably was necessary. Um, because I think like if we just hurried up and made components and we're like, boom, here's your component stuff, go run, have at it. People, I don't think they would have. I think they would be reluctant to use it because they
Mhm.
wouldn't feel that this was going to last for very long because of all the other design systems collapsing.
Yeah. And I suppose that sort of brings us, I think, to a pretty important distinction. I think when we are talking about design systems that are just getting started, it seems like the big barometer or the measure perhaps of success is around getting that initial adoption. But then when we think about design systems that are incredibly mature, like material that's been around for 10 years, sure, you still are thinking about adoption because, to your point, what is a design system if people aren't using it? But are there new measures of success that come in as your design system becomes more mature and adoption kind of feels a little bit more commonplace?
Yeah, I think, there's like a huge like I guess there's like a design system like curve almost. Like so like the start of a design system, there's a lot going on. So like the activity level is very high. But then at some point it does drop off because you're kind of like more in a maintenance mode. Like how often are you gonna change a button or iterate a button? And the biggest change you would probably have is like if you did like a rebrand or something. But I think the next biggest change is like keeping up with technology. So
Mm,
maybe you're switching from like Sketch to Figma or XD to Figma or something like that. So changing tools, code bases as well. Maybe you are changing, like you're adding design tokens. So there's you're not gonna have too much of other, like, constant changes like you did when you first started, but at some point, you will have, like, other changes as you evolve with the technology. So even, like, with design token, the standard that comes out, if you switch from going from Amazon Style Dictionary to the W3C token naming convention, like, that's a change too. So you'll kind of do changes based on slight, modifications or redesigns or
mm.
technology updates.
Yeah, totally. I think the other thing that I have heard a lot, and I'm curious if this jives with you, is how well the design system is able to stay in sync with product and feature updates. And I would imagine that in the early days of the design system, perhaps there is a little bit more of a gap between a product release and those components being available on the design system. But perhaps as you mature, you get those processes in place, then that might be another sort of measure of success, how quickly you're able to like kind of keep those things in line.
Yeah, and I think it depends on, the company and the products that they have and the product cycles, because sometimes you might not ever be able to get everything 100% matching. Um
No, don't tell me that.
but yeah, I think that's it's like, and I think you have to be kind of okay with that almost. I remember, so it was like because all these different engineering teams work on different, could work on different sprint schedules and different paces and stuff. And like, so we like one company I worked at, we had like a web app as well as an iOS app and an Android app. And we would make the change in the web app first, but that like change might not get into the iOS app right away. It might take like a month or two, and then followed on by that, the Android app would get the update. So, like,
Mm,
at some point, like, yeah, like that button component would look the same across all platforms, but then something else would be out of line, like we updated like the drop down or something. Um,
yeah.
and depending on how the design system is organized, so sometimes like there might be a component that's needed that's not in the design system that the web app needs, that they just have to design and code on their own. And then, maybe later on they switch it out, like they add that component to the design system and then they switch that out and they refactor it. So it'll be a little bit of a give and take. Because I think that's the other thing is like sometimes people might feel like the design system is not successful because it's always a bottleneck because
Mm,
they might feel like, "Oh, I have to wait till this component gets coded into the design system library, and I have this deadline, and it's never happening, and then it slows down my progress." But working out what that looks like is also really helpful, and setting those expectations because that could also affect what success looks like. So success might be like, "Hey, it's not in the design system yet, but it will be, and we'll just have to refactor that, and we know that, and that's okay." Um, Versus like, "Oh, the design system is a bottleneck because I can't ever get anything done because they have to, like, create the code and test it out and all this and that." So
yeah, totally. And from what I'm understanding, it sounds like different companies and different design systems teams might fall on different sides of that, right? Like some people might say, hey, I want to make sure that this component is in the design system before we launch, and the design system maybe is a little bit of a bottleneck, or it might be perceived that way. And other folks who are like, hey, I'm willing to refactor and I want to make sure that things get pushed out to our users as quickly as possible. And we will sort of go back and make sure that the design system is up to snuff. I don't think, and I could be wrong, that either one is the right answer or the wrong answer. Or is there a right answer? Tell us if there is.
I mean, the ideal answer is that, like, you don't have to do a lot of rework,
Okay.
things are like so the ideal answer is, like, it would be put in the design system first, and then people can use it, and that would all be done in a very timely manner, no one's a bottleneck, everyone's happy, that's, like, the utopia, but I think realistically, that's not always and, people who are listening can definitely correct me if I'm wrong, like, or if you've had a instance where you were successful with this kind of process, but I think also depends on, like, the age of your company, the age of your
Mm,
projects, where they came from. So my last company, it was, like, a lot of, acquisitions and stuff. So, like, lots of different code bases, lots of different software, like, things and just different pacing of everything. So things were just always very convoluted. There wasn't gonna be a streamlined process, like, right away. So we just kind of had to like, success was getting the best we could get. But maybe if you're a smaller company that, maybe you have, like, 2 designers and your 2 designers are also the people on the design system, then, I think the ideal can happen a lot more nimbly.
mm.
But yeah, I think it just really depends, like, I guess, like, success is, like, what gets you to be successful with, like, the least amount of pain. There is gonna be some pain, right? Like, but yeah, I wish it could be ideal.
Me too. Sasha threw over in the chat that it is often hard for her to tell new product managers why they have to design using only the components that they have now. And I think that there are two parts of that that I am curious to hear your thoughts of. The first being that you always are going to have new people who enter the company who maybe were not privy to what it was like pre-design system and didn't get your whole evangelization mission that you did, and perhaps are coming in and are saying, who cares about this design system? But I think the other thing that is maybe important to note is that I think as practitioners, a lot of times we think about, okay, how do we get designers and developers on board? But like, what do we do for product managers? I feel like they are oft forgotten. How do we get them to be excited about the design system as well?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. They are, I guess, a little bit of like a secondary user because they're not like necessarily an immediate user. But they are still very like they're very involved with the products and feature development and stuff like that. And I do think like that's part of, thinking about like the whole onboarding and the rallying and getting everyone on board. If they've missed that, like it's a great way to like add some of this to your onboarding too. So when you onboard new employees, designers, developers, product managers, just like, like, hey, like we have this so you can have a baseline understanding. And I think, you know, it is interesting because I think people do run into this problem of um, you know, I want to add a component, this weird wacky component to the design system, or why can't you just veer from the design system and just do it just this one time? And there's this like, lack of understanding. So I think what helps with that is like having some sort of, and this is like where I like the like zero height comes in,
Mm,
not to plug zero height, but like design system documentation, right? Like this is where you can kind of have like guidelines to say like this is why we try to use components first that are in the design system and only veer in these certain scenarios because there might be a time where you need to veer from what exists in the
mhm,
design system and that's perfectly fine if it's justifiable. You just don't want to make a habit of it. um and, if they have that understanding, then that's helpful because then it's not like a designer versus a PM kind of fighting and taking it personally. You can be like,
mm,
"Well, this is the reason why we're following these components." Like this is, if veering from these components and just drawing 2 other rectangles fits the scenario of veering, then maybe we veer. It's okay. And same way of like, some people are like, "Hey, I really love my wacky ass component and I want it in the design system, but you're like, that is such bad design. We can't put it in there. But you can't I mean, I guess you can tell them that depending on how how you're feeling, but they might take it personally. But having some guidelines as to like what gets put into the design system is equally important because then they understand that it's nothing personal. It's just that, oh, one, these components already exist, or
Mhm.
two, the UX is bad. So,
In
um,
in that instance, and perhaps we're going on a tangent here, but I have to know how you would handle this. Like, somebody has this terrible component that is bad UX. Do you rely on the design system? Perhaps not the components that exist there, but like the guidelines and the best practices to help you form an argument as to why this person should change that component? Do you let it ride? Is there an option three? What do you do?
yeah. So I think the best thing is to I mean, assume good intent, right? Like, assume that they probably meant well for some strange reason, but they've articulated it in a very terrible way. So just ask them, like, why are you, like, why did you design it this way? Like, I'm curious to hear your thought process. They might have a good reason. And then
Okay.
just, explain, kind of walk them through, like, okay, let's see, like, can we use what exists today? And why can't we use what exists today? And maybe they just didn't think about it. Maybe they're like, "No, I've thought about it. This isn't good." And I think as a last resort, and you definitely know you don't wanna put in your component. So, we had, like, a thing, and this wasn't to, like, bar, like, ugly components. This was, like, just to, like, kind of it's a good way to test a component. So we would say, "We won't put it in the design system right now, but, like, go ahead and create that component for your product, add it
Mhm.
to your product. If it does really well, and if other teams need to use your janky ass component, then maybe we'll consider it for your design system." And you just, like, hope that, like, 3 to 6 months goes by, it's, like, bad UX, and people forget, or no one else is gonna use it, then we don't put it in the design system. Um, I guess that's, like, my my way of not handling it, is by, like, kind of pushing it off to later. Um, I mean, and maybe they do need that janky ass component for that product in that way, which is, fine, but it we don't want the rest of the product suite to use that.
Yeah, totally. And I suppose in this sort of like trial period, you're not denoting like, hey, please don't use this. You sort of are allowing whatever happens organically to happen.
Exactly. So it wouldn't be part of your actual design system, it would be part of, like, their little mini design system, in their own Figma file, and they would just use it, and then we would see
Mm,
how it goes. And then you could have a discussion, like, would if like, some people might need some other products might need to use it.
yeah,
In that case, like, if it's something that more communally people broadly need to use, maybe it gets refined into something that's a little bit, better in terms of UX, or, we decide not to use it. So it, you know, it can live in this, like, one little product in a silo. Yeah.
yeah, totally. Sal threw over in chat, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts here. Of I would love to have an organized feedback forum that is open to all products. Have you ever done anything like that where maybe you throw that component up on a screen or in some way and have people like sort of like critique it and say like this is good or this is bad? Like, does that sound like chaos or does it sound awesome? Because it sounds awesome to me.
It sounds like a nightmare. Um, I guess, like, so so to go back a little bit, um, my previous company that I worked was an enterprise software company, and we had a federated design system. So it was like I wanted people from, like, all products representing. So it was about 15 people. And Dan Mall, like, will also say that 15 people in a design system team is, like, way too much. And, like, I agree. Like, I kinda had to, just to have good product representation, but, like, the amount of decisions that and opinions that you get to, like, and also cross conversations.
Mm,
Like, if, nephew and I are in design system team, there's, like, one path of conversation between you and I. But the minute we add, like, a third person, then there's a path between the third person and you, third person and me, and then you and me. So there's, like, 3 more points.
mhm.
So then you keep adding people, and there's a lot more opinion. Um, and then I think that's the thing, is, like, you you might just get too much opinion, and then how do you sort
Mhm.
through all of that? I think also, And this is like, it's gonna sound like I'm totally evil, but like sometimes design systems are not a democracy. Like I think everything kind of, at least in America, defaults to democracy, right? Like everyone gets a vote, everyone gets to say majority vote, right? Like, but I mean, I, I don't know if that's how design systems should be governed, because not everyone has like the system thinking or the detailed thinking
Mm-hmm.
that's needed to make some of these decisions, or the breadth of knowledge. So I think that's where you need to be careful. So I think opening it up might sound like a great idea, but that can be very, very scary. It can also, yeah, just there's a lot of opinions that you have to weigh, and then no one's going to be happy. And you try planning, like thinking about your friends, like your group of friends, like 10 people, and you're like, where should we go for dinner? And like someone's going to be like, I don't care, whatever, but they're not gonna be
Yeah.
happy, right? So it's the same thing, but maybe worse because it's work related and people are like, my opinion should be valued because I'm at work. Um, and I think, yeah, you'll just end up in a tangled mess. Um,
Who should be the dictator of a design system? Is that like the person who is the head of or director? Is that potentially shared between the lead designer and the lead developer? I suppose like does it matter that that person's discipline who is the dictator in terms of like having both of those sort of disciplines be able to have a say?
yeah, I don't think of it as like a dictatorship, but it's just not a democracy.
So what is it?
I think it's just like, it's like consensus, but like like having representatives. It's like, I don't want to say it's like Congress because I feel like government's like just really messed up. But I think it's like first off, it's like having an understanding of like how decisions are made. And I think
Sure.
certain things are like not everyone needs to weigh in on a button.
Mm,
Like you have designers that know their stuff, that you can trust other designers to be like, "You know what? I don't need to make this decision. I'll let Nef make this decision." Like, she's a competent designer. So if you were a designer, you'd be a competent designer and you'd be able to make those, you'd be able to make those calls. And I would trust that because you are a designer. So I think having a strategic like group of people that can decide, being open to feedback is definitely a good thing. I don't think
yeah.
opening it up widely is ideal because then you're just gonna get a lot of noise. But, being open to be like, "Hey, if people have a comment about this button, happy to have them weigh in and have that discussion." They might have a really good point, but just not opening it to everybody and their whims. But I think in terms of, like, that quote unquote "dictator," like, so when I had the design system team, like, I was the manager of it, but it was very much a
Mhm.
consensus of, like, we had a couple people that would make a decision, and we would trust them and say, "Okay, you know what? They made this decision. We're on board with it." Or if there was a big problem, we would have a discussion. But I think that communal aspect had its limitations because, um, the vice president of design was like, "Who leads the vision of the product?"
Mm,
I was like, "Oh, we all do," but, that wasn't good enough. Like, she wanted someone, like, that was more of a creative director to kind of, like, make sure we were getting the visual aesthetics of the product through in that creative vision, and I didn't come from, like, a creative direction background to do that. Um, I think that was the big thing that was missing, is that we just didn't have like someone to kind of share that creative vision and to lead the team on that creative vision, so to speak. So I think that's kind of like where that dictator kind of comes in. They'll just kind of be like, "Oh, maybe try this purple instead of that purple," that type of thing.
sure.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I feel like you need that, right? Like, I suppose in both of the things that you have recommended, that you might delegate somebody on the team to make a decision, or at the very least, if you've been bogged down with something, you've spent hours talking about it, somebody to kind of just say, you know what, this is what we're going to try. And it doesn't necessarily mean that that is the end all be
Yeah,
all. You might say,
exactly.
if this doesn't work out, we'll revisit it. But it can really hamper the success of a design system if you're spending so much time talking about the minutia and you don't get beyond that.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where my role, as like, I was a design ops person and managing the design system, was that to kind of like not necessarily be the tiebreaker, but be the person that kind of kept tabs on things more logistically of like, "You know what? We're kind of over rotating on this discussion. Let's take a break. Because once I became a manager, like you have to start thinking about how much resources cost. Like maybe not down to the actual dollar amount, but like, say you opened up like 50 designers to comment on this one component, and it's like an
Mm,
hour, and they're each paid like $100 an hour. That's like what? Like 5 grand for an hour
yeah.
for a button discussion that didn't get anywhere. So you start thinking in terms of that type of resourcing, and it starts to scare you where you're like, okay, this discussion needs to be cut a little bit, like, curate a little bit more tightly so we're not wasting time and we can spend more time doing other things. So you become very aware of resourcing that way, of like, oh, this was a very expensive meeting. This was a very expensive decision. Like, it didn't need to be this expensive. So for sure.
Yeah, I feel like I saw something on Instagram of a fake product that, like, right there in Google Calendar, it's like, "This meeting costs whatever it is. Are you sure you want to proceed?" With the idea that people stop scheduling things. But that is a very interesting perspective when we think about a design system and, like, what resources we're putting into it, and not just to say that, like, "Hey, we shouldn't put any resources into it," but, like, are we allocating our resources in the right way?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's huge because I think that's the other thing, like, to tie it back to success. If you're spending so much resources just to get this little thing off the ground, and it's not little, but, like, some people might think it's little because it's
Sure.
just little bits and pieces going into a product, they're gonna be like, "Why did it cost, like, 15 designers and, like, all of this time, and what do we have to show for it?" So it could feel not very successful to some stakeholders.
Yeah, totally. I guess before we get out of here, I know we are coming toward the end of our time together, but one of the things that we talked about in prepping for this episode is, what place does change have in successful design systems? And one of the things that you said earlier is, when we think about mature design systems, part of that is in how well they adapt to change, right? Like, you go to a new design tool, you use a new code framework because it's going to make your developers so much faster. But on the other hand, we know that people are going to be people, and change is incredibly jarring, and it can also reduce the confidence that folks have in the design system. So, how do you sort of decide what is the necessary change that's going to be important to the continued success of the design system, and what's the change that we leave behind in favor of a slow, steady, predictable approach?
Yeah. So I think, that's the thing. Change is hard for people, even if they know it's for their own good. You're disrupting their typical routines. And I think as you're doing so, like, I think involving people from the start is really, really important. So even if they're not maybe making the components in Figma or coding them, at least that they know what's going on is really helpful. And then even doing like little like prototypes or show and tells, or like little like, I don't know, try things out. So, as we got like maybe like a couple components built, we shared the Figma library with people and we're like, test it out. Like, try to build this screen, see what it's like. And then it got them used to using the components the way we've organized them, the way the little variations work that they can switch on and off, which was really cool. So, anytime there's like a new change, especially with like Figma variables, it's like if there's something new, it's like do a little tutorial, do a little like,
Mm,
"Hey, come test this out and we wanna get your feedback." Because I think that's the other thing is like when, the design system team first made the component library, some of it was organized in a weird way that it was hard to find things. So based on that testing, we were able to tweak the way we organized the library. So that was really helpful. So kind of involving people early on just to test out things from the start gets them warmed up and gets them ready to make that change. But it also feels great for them because they have the ability to provide input and feedback to make it something that's going to be useful for them. So I think from that aspect, it's super, super helpful. Um, so anytime you can make a change, try to do a little pilot, do a little prototype, see how that goes, get some feedback, involve others, do like lunch and learns, little demos, that type of stuff just makes things really easy. I think the bigger thing is like if you are switching from one product to another. So like my old company, we moved from Sketch to Figma,
mm,
and the way Figma works is very, very different. And so we made sure that everyone got trained on how to use Figma. Like we pulled together, like, here are the top 10 videos to get started with, because we gave them time during like the workday, because otherwise, designers are gonna have to, like, work evenings and weekends to kind of figure out how to use Figma, and they don't have that time. Like, what happens if you want to spend time with your family, or you just don't want to work past 40 hours? Like, right? Like, it's, like, why should you have to do this outside of work? So, we built in time for them to, like, learn and get those tutorials so they can feel confident in using the new tools, so they wouldn't be so, like, hesitant to adopt the new system and the new way of doing things.
Totally. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially when you're talking about a large scale change and something that impacts your day to day, right? Like you
Yeah.
were basically living in Sketch and now we want you to live in Figma. April had a question over in the chat. What processes do you use to help minimize downstream impacts of making changes to components?
Yeah, I guess so. Let's see. I think kind of doing all this education at the, like, front load the education aspect and making sure there's a lot of channels for them people to communicate is really helpful. If you do notice there's downstream impacts of component issues, finding out what they are and trying to figure out, like, what might be the root cause of that, because there might be
Mm,
something higher upstream that you can change in the design system. So maybe someone just didn't know where to go, or just didn't, like, they were a new engineer or what have you. And so maybe if they're a new engineer, maybe there's something missing in the onboarding process, or maybe they should have a peer that they pair up with so they understand how to use the design system, that type of thing, um, to kind of mitigate those issues going forward.
yeah, totally. It seems like so much of what we're talking about goes back to having a vision for the design system and having adequate education, especially when you launch it. But that education doesn't really stop. And you are continuously evangelizing, showing best practices, making sure that people are aware of processes and everything in between.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing is, like, when people are starting design systems, you're always thinking, okay, design stuff, libraries, make those components in Figma or Sketch, and then you're thinking, okay, code, I need to code this, and that's all you're thinking about. But there is that, like, educate. Maybe that's where the PM comes in, right? Maybe the PM is
Mm,
the bridge who can be like, hey, let's make sure everyone knows how to use these tools, so then we can knock out some really rad features. I don't know, that then they can understand. They might go, "Oh, I can see why we need to follow the design
ah.
system." Maybe. I've solved the world's problems.
I was just about to say, right here today, we have figured out how product managers become an integral part of design systems. You heard it here first, folks. Um, yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I suppose lots of things to think about for early design systems, sort of thinking about how you do education, how you get that initial buy-in, and then as the design system matures, being open to what sort of change and what sort of communication you might need to continue to have. Anything else? Like, is there like one tidbit? Like, if you wrapped all of this up into a single sentence that was foolproof, going to lead to a successful design system, what would it be?
Wow, that's a lot of pressure. I just solved the role of PMs in design systems. Um, I think if I had to wrap it all up, it's like, think about what you imagine the end point to be of, like, everyday users. Like, they're like, they come into work and they're just like, I love working here because the design system does this for me. Like, and like, what are you gonna do to help them get to that, like, idea and that thought? So a lot of it comes down to, like, a lot of what we talked about today. But thinking, like, longer, like, bigger picture, not just, because I think when you're starting a design system, your main focus is, like, little bits and pieces, little bits and pieces. But that's,
Mhm.
like, just the first step, like, that's the tip of the iceberg, but really it's like, what am I gonna do, like, to make someone so happy to use this? Because that kind of, like, speaks, like, that resonates with the idea of success.
Totally. And it still goes back to emotions, right? Like everything is around that. And success, sure, we can look at it from the quantitative things that we get from our tools. We can look at it from the feedback that we get and NPS scores and all of that. But at the end of the day, the really successful design systems are the ones that people are jacked to use, ones that people are really excited to work on. And that sort of feeling permeates in throughout the entire company, and leads to really good adoption and just like this overall feeling of success.
Yeah, 100% for sure.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining episode 3 of Design Systems Beyond the Button. We are looking forward to being back next month with a brand new topic.
Cool. So that ends the recording part of the of the episode. Because if you aren't aware, we do this as a podcast as well. So you can always subscribe if you can't make these episodes live. And I'm happy to answer Josh's question about what indicators do you use to determine a major/minor version change for a component. And I think the answer is it depends. um, so I think if you're building your design system early on, like, and you're starting from scratch, like, don't even count versions just because it's
Mm.
just going to be a hot mess anyway. And I think some people can over focus on versioning. So it's like, it's almost like don't worry about that until you have like your first quote unquote stable release, which would be like a release that people are actively using. Um, and then I think I would count, and this is hard. So there's different levels of version. There's a coded versioning. There's your Figma versioning. There's your documentation versioning. So that, and like a lot of people try to strive to align those all to like the same numbers, but that's just like really impossible. So I think the way is to not just don't do that. Um, I think anything most components changes over time will be minor versions until something bigger. So like a really big change, like maybe you do a visual like rebranding, change brand colors or something like that would be more of a major change. Um, but I think I wouldn't think of anything like, yeah, it would have to be something pretty big for it to be a major change versus a minor change, like an overhaul of something. But everything else can be minor. And I don't know, like it depends on what you're working on, but like I wouldn't stress about minor versioning. Like it's important to version your stuff, obviously, but making sure someone's using whatever, but like people just want to use the most current thing that they are supposed to use. So as long as they can tell like that's the most current thing, that's all they'll want to use. So uh I guess that's like my hot take on it. But versioning can get very stressful, so nobody stress out. Hopefully that was helpful advice to help people not stress out.
Easier said than done. When you feel stressed, just stop it.
Yeah, just don't it's too complicated. Well, I'm glad you feel validated. So, but yeah, I think feel free to like share this recording with anybody. We will be your we'll be the people that will like just say what you want to say, but like there's no baggage attached if we say it. You just hit play.
um, all right.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for joining the webinar. I am Nef, Betty. Nice to meet you. Or you can call me Team Zero Height. It works either way.
You are like
But
Team Zero Height.
but thank you so much for joining. We hope to be back next year with a couple more episodes. If there is anything that you want to hear us talk about or any feedback that you have, please feel free to send it our way. We hope everybody has a really happy holidays.
Yes. Happy holidays, and we'll catch you next year.
All right. See you all.
Bye.